So Ruth, do you want to start us off maybe and just give us a brief overview of kind of the paper that you wrote, which we can link to when we post this?
Fabulous, yeah. And what I can do is I'll give sort of the higher level sort of dive in, just so we're all kind of grounded in something, and then obviously we can sort of move, piggyback from that into positive sum design.
I'm sorry, Ruth, to interrupt you. If we're going to record, let's start that conversation one more time, because in the middle of that, Arthi asked me, is it recording? And it popped up on the chat. and so, no, it's all good.
It didn't do the recording, the Zoom recording thing.
Oh, yeah. It
because I'm recording locally onto the computer. Not onto, I don't know how to make Zoom record.
Got it.
But
okay,
yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Super. Sorry.
No problem.
We shouldn't post in the chat, though. Is that what you were saying?
You can now, because it's off to the side. That's it's a learning experience. So we should be good now. But okay.
All systems go?
All systems go.
Cool. Well, what I can do is give a little bit of a high view of the paper on choice infrastructure, and then link it to some of the positive sum design issues that we've been talking about. So we can use it pretty much as a jumping point. We don't have to talk about the paper fully, but it did introduce some very interesting issues, I think, which are quite relevant to all of our interests. But before I do that, actually, do we want to give quick intros? Was that part of what would also be useful to keep this a little standalone, or should I just
yeah, I think it's a great idea.
All right, well, I can introduce myself. I am Ruth Schmidt. I'm an associate professor at the Institute of Design, which is part of the Illinois Institute of Technology. And I focus primarily on behavioral design. So looking at behavioral science, but with a heavily design perspective.
I'm Arthi. I'm an adjunct professor of practice at Carnegie Mellon School of Design. I teach design for social innovation. I'm also the founder of Catcher Education and the Community Success Institute. I'm interested in using design and user research methods to help to demystify complexity for audiences that make decisions with lots of information.
Okay, I'll introduce myself. My name is Will Rudder. I am currently pursuing my master's in design at ID, where Ruth works at Illinois Tech, as well as a master's of public policy and administration at the Stewart School of Business, which is also at Illinois Tech.
I'm Ian Gotcher. I'm an assistant professor of practice in engineering and computer science at Brown University. My interests are in design process and creative strategies, for coming up with new ideas, new technologies, but I'm also interested in these kinds of big ideas in terms of how design can kind of change the world, which include positive sum design. So there you have it.
Excellent. So I'll jump in, give a bit of a sort of flyover of the paper itself, and at least some of those major themes, but then obviously you can tee it up and take it in whatever direction makes sense. So the title of the paper, the main thrust of it, is introducing this notion of choice infrastructure, which is kind of a riff on a more familiar term, which is choice architecture, which in the behavioral sciences is often about basically this design of immediate choice environments. So when we're making choices which are difficult or complicated or even seemingly simple, because we have cognitive biases that can impact how we perceive our options or whether we even have options, when people design the choice architecture, it's usually around what are the specific conditions in kind of a narrower way. So when we hear the term nudge is probably quite familiar to many audiences, the idea that you can change the frame of options or you can create defaults, etc. All these are about choice architecture. But what I try to make a point about in this particular paper is that that's really only solving part of the problem. And even if you solve that part super well, it may actually not be a good solution because you've neglected all of the choice conditions or the infrastructure which is surrounding it. You put a solution into an environment, into a set of conditions, into infrastructure, And if that is not equipped, then A, you may have a good solution that simply doesn't work, but you may also have this issue where you've actually solved for a component of a challenge, but you're putting it into a system which is very inequitable and which is rewarding certain types of folks over other types of folks, and almost certainly has value embedded in it, which then dictates the nature of the solutions that you're proposing. So it's not denying that choice architecture continues to be important, but it's essentially arguing for the importance of really sort of taking a design lens very deliberately towards the infrastructural components as well, so that when you're solving a solution, you're actually solving at a systems level. So that's kind of the basic gist of it. And that does introduce a few things which are important and useful to talk about, which are quite relevant to positive sum design as well. So one is that you have lots of stakeholders involved. Typically speaking, infrastructure, if you think of that as like the plumbing that underlies solutions, even in, again, a very simple type of situation, you may have people on the receiving end, but you also have folks who are very strongly incented, for example, in behaving in certain ways because maybe those are the metrics that they're held accountable to, or maybe that's the way that the structures are simply best equipped to sort of, keep people going. We tend to work with systems that sort of are, even if you're trying to increase efficiency, for example, efficiency can sometimes get in the way of good solutions just because it's easy to operate. We also then have to think about kind of the ripple effects of solutions. So infrastructure, which supports sort of certain types of solutions, can then have implications downstream. So a classic example of that is you can make great efforts to increase diversity in hiring, right? Lots of companies are trying to do that. But then if you don't have infrastructure that's more broadly supportive, it means that you may not have any mentoring structure or support. You may also not provide equitable opportunity once those people have been hired. So all of these sort of infrastructural decisions are not just about point-in-time solutions, it's also thinking kind of at that broader set. And in collection with all this, we obviously have to then weigh how people have different values. And so not only is it that people operate or function in a different way, but I sometimes use the term choice posture. Like we all have our own choice postures or inclinations towards things. And again, we're not solving for people as brains in jars, as I sometimes overly flippantly say. We're actually designing for humans who both have their perceptions of what to do, but also are sort of held in place, right, by the structures that are there. So in sort of conceptualizing what this could look like, there's a framework that I introduced, which is sort of how we might think about creating choice infrastructure, so things like aligning on definition, or creating processes and mechanics and examining policies to make sure that we're sort of recognizing what we're introducing, examining accountability, so even who is accountable for what decisions can have a huge impact on what happens, institutional culture, and sort of evaluating what is happening. If we're not continually tuned in, then we may get in trouble there. But maybe as kind of a kickoff to the conversation here, there may be a few really important things that we can sort of discuss as a group. One is that this whole idea of introducing new choice infrastructure kind of relies on the fact that we can go in and change things at a broader system scale, and yet we all know that systems in power like to stay that way. And if we're trying to think about this as an opportunity to introduce positive sum design, we also have to recognize that certain stakeholders are probably going to be pretty keen on keeping it zero sum because that's what's actually working for them quite well. So that's kind of a top-down question, if you will, that we can think about. Maybe another take on this might also be, how do we ensure, what are good processes and sort of good ways to employ design, the way that we're all interested in, to ensure that bottom-up sensibilities are coming from all different stakeholders. So that's sort of our bottom-up approach. And then maybe a third ball to throw in the ring is that as designers, we all know that there's a certain amount of bias, and it's not self-interest necessarily, but we all have our own perspectives on how to solve problems. So how do we as designers also ensure that in creating new choice infrastructures, you can't really take bias entirely out, but how are we being thoughtful about how to design a new system and a new set of conditions which are going to be genuinely beneficial and equitable, but also kind of getting out of our own way and being continually reflexive to make sure that what we're hopefully achieving is actually creating its intended purpose. So those are kind of a couple of things that seem potentially interesting, but let's not feel constrained to those necessarily. But would love to hear, how we might sort of take this kernel of an idea potentially and move it forward towards some of our shared interests.
So if I'm kind of understanding this correctly, design, I mean, there's kind of the top down and the bottom up, right? So you're designing kind of choice architecture or choice infrastructure for, well, I guess it would be choice architecture, I think, and you can push back on that for people that are stakeholders within the system, let's say, the people at the company or whatever. And then you're also talking about those in power that have the ability to keep the system in place or to be able to prevent change. And I guess what in terms of positive sum design, we talked a lot about kind of that first group, right? The users, the stakeholders, the people that are in the system, and how we can kind of create ways for people to see that there's more value available, there's more meaning, there's more possibilities for collaboration by creating these channels of communication and other things that we've talked about. I'd be interested to explore a little bit about the other side of it, and I think that's where the infrastructure part comes in. I don't know if you would agree with that distinction between the bottom up part being choice architecture, whereas maybe the top down is more choice infrastructure, only because it has it's more ingrained, it's more it's more the system itself in which these other stakeholders operate within. And I'm wondering, I guess the question I'm trying to get to is something like, how do you reframe the game for those stakeholders that feel that the zero-sumness is in their best interest, to get them to understand that maybe they get more if they try to find these win-wins? And because that seems like that's where the big change starts to happen, the big at scale. So I don't know if I captured everything you were saying exactly correctly, so feel free to correct me, but I'd be interested in exploring that. I mean, hearing what you all think about that.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, Ian, you took the words straight out of my mouth in terms of thinking about how it seems to me that an approach that a truly positive sum approach would be thinking about these stakeholders that may benefit from from the system as it currently is, and the positive sum approach would actually be trying to show those folks as well how they would benefit from changing the system, right? And that's why I think positive sum design is such a sort of powerful change-making idea, because it's not sort of traditional disruption where you're saying like, it's going to be so powerful and there will be winners and losers, but that if we disrupt correctly, then the folks who are in power, they won't have any choice. The idea here is that actually this is truly we can show how everybody how the change is productive for them, wherever you are in the system, right? And so I don't know exactly. I'm right behind you there, Ian, in terms of how do we, or a really important part of it being that in fact, there's positive sum value being unlocked for everyone, and the system does include not only sort of the it includes everybody that's involved in the system, whether or not they are powerful in the system or not, right? And so that's a more sort of, I think you have to take that broad look at the stakeholders in order to have something that comes out that's really effective, and that can actually happen, right? That you can where that ends up being that can be instantiated and it can have success in the world.
Yeah, and just sort of picking up on one or two of those threads. First of all, this idea of architecture. Yes, I think architecture, if we think of that as more about sort of impacting individual people, no matter where they sit in that system, because that's really about kind of individual behavior and individual cognitive bias. And in fact, that's sometimes a bit of a, in my mind, a bit of a weakness of where behavioral science sits right now, is that it's still thinking at this individual level. Whereas, yeah, the infrastructure, I think the way that I've been thinking about it and the way that we're talking about it now is really, redesigning system conditions so that, again, no matter where you sit, you're still participating, in this new set of either constraints or enablers, but it's essentially sort of that underlying structure. So looking at a more collective and system-wide view.
So there's like a couple of things that came up in the paper and then the questions and actually what you guys are all saying that I'm going to kind of just throw them out there because I'm not exactly sure how they fit or relate. So I think you all know, like, I come from a bit of a policy background, so like some of the things I think about are like a little bit on the side of like regulation or policy or politics even. So a little bit of, so for when we have these complicated systems and there's a zero-sum bias kind of built into the system, and I'm thinking about government systems where they build nudges in, there's like a couple of biases working that I think are a little bit there. One is incumbency bias, right? Which I don't know if we talk about in like behavioral science, but when we think about like political theory and even fund, and then the other side of this whole thing, I think is funding and who pays for things versus who consumes the service or gets the benefit from the service. And I think that there's some things that are kind of underlying in these types of systems that make them perhaps tend towards zero sum because it's like a simple construction that people can understand, but the conditions in the system actually, they're more complicated. And zero sum, it sort of assumes that the funder and the payer and the person setting the conditions, so the incumbent kind of in the system, that they would know the right thing for the other person or to do. So like they're setting and like this is like how I'm sorry, I'm like not articulating it very well, but it's like the user in the system, the person who's having the intervention acted upon them, who has the needs that the system is serving, like Health and Human Services or the institution serving, they're the ones making the choice in the choice architecture. So they're the ones for whom choice architecture is created, but there's a set of actors and research and systems and incumbents that are setting the policy that determines which nudges get put into place. And in that process, the end user is generally not a part of the process at all. Like it's like researchers and systems that determine this is the right thing to do based on our knowledge, our research, our expertise, the things that we are getting from the outside that are like not part of the like internal stakeholder group. So there's like external factors that are creating conditions, and then the system itself is like reinforcing and creating structures based on these external factors that then act upon or create the choice architecture for the people that are making the choices. So it seems like there's something in there about how like incumbents don't want to change. People that think they're smart and know the answers want to set the conditions. Funders want to set conditions for things. And so there's some sort of split between the people that benefit in the system and then the people that actually set the conditions in the system or decide that they want to purchase or not purchase. So like it's relying on market mechanisms for feedback, like supply and demand, but these are generally systems where the market is not the thing that's acting. The market's acting on another level. It's acting at the level of how much funding does each agency get, not which is the best solution for the person who's actually buying the solution. So I think and so there's like, that seems to be a split. And the thing there that I thought I'd call out was there's something about felt needs versus perhaps anticipatory needs, where the choice infrastructure is about anticipatory needs and choice architecture is dealing with felt needs. And there's something about, perhaps it's like needs definition that prioritizes the felt needs of the population that's being acted upon rather than prioritizing effectively like anticipatory needs that are coming from the system itself. Anyways, those are a few things that I was thinking.
A little bit of a definition of felt and anticipatory needs. I mean, I think I know what you mean, but just so that we understand.
Oh yeah, so felt needs are the needs that the user experiences. So like when you're working in a community, and so like I like to use this example in class a lot. So we went into a community near Carnegie Mellon, and we wanted to do a project on environmental sustainability, and we wanted to work on air quality because we knew that in that community they had bad air quality, they had high rates of childhood asthma, they had high rates of people not going to work because they had issues at home, and so on and so forth. And so we, like with our research, had come up with the idea that the set of anticipatory needs we came up with was, look, if we create interventions around home air quality, instructions for when to vacuum, how to help your kids do different things so that, you know, you're doing the right things at home at the right time, then we will improve lives through reducing environmental risks in the community. Kids will go to school, they won't be sick, everything's going to get better. So we went to the community, we were super pumped. We were like, this is what we're going to work on. We're going to help you fix these problems. It's going to be super great. And they were just like, what are you talking about? Like, I can't get to work. I need to eat. I need help with these childcare issues. What are you talking about with this like air quality business? This has nothing to do with the things that I feel with my felt needs. And so there was this split between like the anticipatory, like what we thought the needs were going to be and where we were going to solve for versus what the needs that the users actually expressed, their felt needs were. And so a lot of what we find is in our first step of the process is to create that either in some cases buy-in, like we're actually trying to work on the same problem, or perhaps more like related to the positive sum versus zero sum, there needs to be the act or some method for defining shared values and shared goals and shared needs such that the anticipatory needs and the felt needs can like kind of come together, because ultimately we're trying to solve the same problem. We wanted to reduce poverty, improve workplace attendance, reduce children missing school, so that the community was healthier, happier, safer, and and more productive and more positive outcomes. So we wanted to get to the same place. It's just that how like the needs that we were solving for were different. And so that to me was like is an example of the system, because we were talking to doctors, we were talking to healthcare workers, we were talking to city planners. So we had a whole bunch of biases about how you fix the problem that had nothing to do with what they were feeling on the ground, even though we were all trying to get to the same place. I can send you like a paper about it too.
Well, the reason why I was asking, I think that the insight that I think that you're bringing here is it seems like it adds this other dimension of time to these problems, right? So if I'm understanding it correctly, like the felt need seems immediate, right?
Yes.
And then you have the anticipatory or future facing, right? And if your immediate needs in the moment are not being met, it's very difficult to think about the future. And there's already these kinds of hierarchies that start to get built into that. And I'm wondering, if we thought about positive sum design on a time scale, and maybe that's something we should consider at some point, because the immediate example that I was thinking about, I don't know if it's completely correct, but talking about choice infrastructure is the relation between labor and management, right? It sets itself up as being kind of a zero-sum game if you look at it, in a very superficial way. Like management's just trying to get as much labor out of their workers as they possibly can, and they'll exploit them, to whatever degree. But that's a really dumb long-term strategy, right? Over time, you're going to destroy your business, and ultimately, the positive sum game hopefully, becomes the better option for both the choice architecture and the choice infrastructure, the top up and the top down. I don't know if that fits perfectly, but I'm just interested in we don't have to explore this right now, but just the time dimension of this seems like it's really an important factor, and how we are progressing towards something better. And like I said, it's hard to kind of focus on the future if your felt needs are not being met. And I get that, and so it's. There's a power dynamic in that. I can't think about tomorrow if I'm thinking about today.
There's also, and this is maybe Arthi picking up on what you're saying too, because that's a great illustration of there isn't just one way to define needs or values, right? So there's the time dimension, which is equally important, but then even, in particular, I get really aggravated when I see studies that equate going to the gym with good health. Because to me, that's like such a way to think about what good health is, because depending on what your particular needs are, maybe your idea of good health is like, I have enough energy to walk down the block and back because I'm starting at a different point, or because everyone in my family has several lung, long-term severe conditions. And so I'm sort of navigating even what good health means and what it looks like given the reference points that I'm surrounded by. So there's this sort of longitudinal view, but there's also, I think, and you even Arthi used the term, about sort of shared definitions or shared sort of standards for things. I think it goes beyond empathy. Like, I know that empathy was the big word for a long time, but it's not just about empathy. It's actually about like genuinely kind of getting a sense of what is important. So if you don't have that perceived understanding or engagement, that is, again, this combination of top down, bottom up, to understand kind of what are you even designing into, that also feels like it engineers these situations where you're simply designing for the wrong thing because you assume that you have a shared perspective on what's important. And that can be right now. We can screw up even in the present, solving for those immediate needs, and we can screw up solving for those future needs if we haven't aligned on what do people actually need and want, and what does that actually look like and mean to them.
Yeah.
I think in your paper, Ruth, you talk a lot about definitions and sharing definitions. And so like a little bit to the point to your question related to, so like I started by talking about kind of theory about needs, felt needs and so forth, but then like you talk a lot about kind of bottom up and I think that to some extent like co-designing and like participatory design, at least to me, seems like it's a mechanism, or at least what the question I was going to say is like, is human-centered or user-centered design trying to guard against this type of like misalignment of needs by having users involved earlier in the process? And perhaps what we should be thinking about is like, is activities or methods for complex stakeholders early in the process that allow them to express their needs, felt and otherwise, and sort of more amorphous and in a way that helps to move it in a direction that people can agree upon. So it's like, is like user-centered design kind of a natural way to guard against like a sort of a bias towards zero sum? Because it's like, if you prioritize the needs of all of your stakeholders, I mean, this is a question. I don't know. It's like by allowing and enabling and empowering your users to articulate what they want and need, are we as designers engaging in a bottoms up process? And if we like incorporate the definition of values and the definition of currency, I think, Ian, to what you were talking about, what is valuable, what is currency, what do people need and want and measure in terms of success, then perhaps like the owner of the problem or the owner of the solution is different, and then the beneficiaries, then everybody becomes a beneficiary. I don't know, it's just like in certain systems, it's like the receiver of the intervention is a passive recipient, it seems like, and those systems seem like they don't prioritize the needs of the end user, because the end user is this like passive recipient of the thing. But perhaps if we're moving things up to, instead of the level of choice architecture, so like choice architecture kind of operates at the level of like the user is the recipient of the thing, and then they have the choice that they have, we are guiding because we've already determined this is the right set of options for you, and so you only get to pick from these options. But perhaps what we're saying is like, let's go up a level and say, let's identify a more complete universe of options, maybe? I don't know, sorry, yeah.
Well, and just to sort of expand on that, maybe too far, but we also have situations like designing for sustainability, right? Where it has that time frame issue, but also it's almost like the planet is a stakeholder now. So there's that's like the ultimate systems level piece of it. So right, it's definitely going beyond the individuals, and even in like behavioral public administration, there's this term that gets used sometimes, like nudging the nudgers, right? So that's like nudging the people who are part of the system. But this choice infrastructure argues sort of above that, even because right, we're solving at a systems level, but there is a very interesting perspective to be had that in some cases we're even solving for sort of non-users, non-humans, when we are thinking about things like, democracy, sustainability, like these, and granted, those are like big things to be solving for. But the positive sum in an interesting way, can work for all audiences, human or non-human. Not to get overly sci-fi about it, but that sort of helps to stretch our thinking too.
And I think the distinction that's sometimes made between human-centered design and humanity-centered design is also important as well. Whereas, human-centered design, I think, if we're going to kind of lump it into that kind of architecture, whereas the humanity is maybe more infrastructure in the sense that, you're looking at the systems level of things. And I think both are important, but if it's once it, as we kind of brought up, or alluded to, there's you can have a kind of critique of empathy in this as well, because human-centered design is very much focused on empathizing with the user. I mean, we can talk about, the difference between cognitive and affective empathy, and kind of how is it really possible to empathize with the user? We can have that conversation, but ultimately, I think you also have to think about designers as bringing a set of skills and expertise to a situation, and stakeholders having a different kind of expertise, that their lived experience. And I think that's what participatory design and co-design do well when it's done well. It kind of equalizes those expertise, and it brings them together in such a way where everybody's contributing and everybody has something to offer. So I don't know. I don't know if that's helpful in terms of kind of trying to lump them in different categories. But I'm also noticing that we have a timer on there too, so I don't know what that means.
Yeah.
But
I was looking at that. I think I've been kicked off of CMU's campus-wide Zoom, which sort of makes sense since I am no longer there. So we'll have to find another sort of solution for this in the future. But yeah, we have 2 minutes 45 seconds left before we get kicked off.
We can do a part 2.
We can.
Yeah.
Are there any kind of final thoughts that anybody has to kind of bring some of these things together that might set up our next conversation?
So I started, and you guys, I think you can sort of tell this about me. So I'm I am like an examples person. Like, I need to draw things and I need examples. So like 3 things. One, I use human-centered, user-centered, and humanity-centered interchangeably. It's a problem. I know it's a problem. So I'll just say that. So and related to that, we were talking about stakeholder maps in class this week, and they said, what defines a stakeholder? Like, what do we do with non-human stakeholders? And I was like, stakeholders are things you can act on or you can change. And sometimes the central stakeholder isn't a human, like, for example, trying to go to space, or we actually use the example of bees as pollinators, so like whatever. So, and that relates to my other point, which is I'm just starting to pull examples where we might be able to test some of this stuff. And so one thing I was thinking about was community-based needs assessment, which is a place where actually they like anticipatory needs in community-based needs assessment, but I have a real critique of it because it's hard for users to do that. So there's like felt needs, anticipatory needs, there's a lot of critique there. And then microloans as a way to think about, so like I'm really interested in funding structures and like funder versus consumer versus like government bias, and microloans seem like a way that might break that or might change that. So I was thinking about microloans, community-based building, bottom of the pyramid, examples. So that's it. Some things to think about for the future.
And just, I mean, you mentioned, things like loans. Those are obviously, financial in a very explicit sense, but also, I think all of you have mentioned also this term currency, right? Like that sense of where those things are important. I will be honest, right? This whole choice infrastructure notion is right now, it's kind of culled from examples. And so it was a way to kind of codify some thinking around that. But I would double down on, finding test cases to sort of continue to poke and prod and to sort of see where that can lead versus feeling like, oh, well, it's a theory and now we're done. I actually think that's super important.
I think giving some more attention to examples and even visualization, we were talking, I was just writing some little graphs trying to figure out how felt needs related to anticipatory needs on this timeline, and just how that relates to human versus humanity centered. I mean, just try to put together visually some of these different concepts to help kind of navigate a little bit better. So